I'm Lily O'Neill. I'm a researcher with Melbourne Climate Futures at the University of Melbourne, and I'm here to talk to you about clean energy and climate repair and how First Nations people can save the world. And I'm standing here in the Mount Buffalo National Park, near the top of Mount Buffalo, in the northeast of Victoria, about 300 kilometres northeast of Melbourne. This area around me all burnt savagely during the Black Summer bushfires of 2019-2020. Those fires were the worst in the recorded history of southeast Australia. They burnt about 18 million hectares of land, an area that is almost twice the size of England. Now, many of the areas burnt by those Black Summer bushfires have since regenerated, at least to some extent. And that is because the Australian bush needs fire. Indeed, most eucalyptus trees depend on fire for their reproduction. But you'll see that the trees here have not regenerated, despite it now being nearly 2 years since those fires came through. And that is because alpine areas like this are not supposed to burn, and the vegetation here has not adapted to be burnt, particularly by the type of savage wildfire that came through here at the start of 2020. Climate change is a key driver of fires like the one that burnt through here, and these fires also had a hugely negative impact on greenhouse gas emissions. The estimate is that 715 million tonnes of carbon dioxide went into the atmosphere as a result of those fires. But as Michael Sean Fletcher, a Wiradjuri man and an associate professor at the University of Melbourne, writes, fires like these in 2020 are caused by climate change, but they also have another cause. These fires are more than just a climate problem. To understand this better, we need to travel back to Australia as it was in 1788, at the time that the British ships first arrived to colonise the continent. In 1788, Australian First Nations people had been living on the continent for 65,000 years. In comparison, hominids only arrived in Europe a mere 40,000 years ago. And in complete contrast to later wrong views that First Nations people merely wandered the earth, they managed their landscape intently, with care and with deep purpose. It is a myth that Australia was an untamed wilderness in 1788. First Nations people had a continent-wide, scientific, complex, specific system of land management for their land, their country. The continent-wide landscape they created, what author Bill Gammage calls the greatest estate on earth, covered more land than any other estate on earth. Across Australia, early Europeans commented again and again that the land looked like a park, with extensive grassy patches and pathways, open woodlands and abundant wildlife. It evoked a country estate in England. This was no wilderness. As Bill Gammage says, the law, an ecological philosophy enforced by religious sanction for First Nations people, compelled them to care for their country. People lived and died to ensure this. And their chief ally in this system of land management was fire.
Kondangat pere gunet wate wati. Kono minanga legani paka wore imanta par por koro birini. Olgoin wale wan meri. Iman helicopter, fireballs, magna bui. Olgo nyale kan tudu kat peri. Ngayang yo ding ibabu. Kungo karo korogoni.
Hari bang buang hari boldan. Orang hari boldanan.
Sometimes I feel a bit scared because such a long time people that lived up here and walked out, and the spirit is like there's people always watching you, probably waiting for the family to return and manage this country again, manage the fire, manage the country as it was managed for thousands of years.
Mana yalan mood pera kore manur. Pada ul ke. Wai kali nan mana iman manlar. Wala milat alar ini. Bol kau ngori nan manlar mana. Rui. Tul rui. Kadung go ni. Mana bet rui. Tal kadung duri. Wai on bewa. Padahal jujung na manlar kau ni mana Karrina. Nan kalar. Wana kayaki. Nyalagen. Manur. Baik ada uruk nak nan kayak ki. Wana kapon kayak kon manur.
Polki gun mayali gun buy gari ewan. Ari polk nak nan. Gun mayali. Dai iungi gur mangkat peri. Wan polki ari chardur beri palanda scientist. Babu ngari nak nan manur. Kurung kai meren, kunumelang kai meren. Keke ay meren. Koro ngari na. Kure hari dur beri ngari ulge. Kure bui pui ga. Kamalai bar pun ke. Makure wole. Iman bari tombun. Bang ari tengke manur. Kuna kain kaman pun. Kunku kolteno. Kaka jort man kama grow. Iman kari nak nan manur.
It's 2:30.
Wan kundol ngaya woodman. Kama crow. Ari jardur beri balanda scientist. Kure peta kun mai lebet pere. Mak kure ngat kun mai legat pere. Tapar pul kandiu. No beri bengani kun mai le yaud ken.
Wan. Ngari bol ngai bekar mi kono ngari jale anjat ngari yer gani. Bari ki boleh wei ka binin magi umege ngari yo bari bol ngai buni. Wan ngari jale ngari yer gani ko boleh.
Ko boleh o.
Ari ko ini ngari nani ka bari wala ibe mengan kun. Ari menga ngapat gari wo ibi.
Ngapat.
Ari bano ijan kai mi like that bugari ime ngapat.
Iman ari ako research. Wai ari man bom agreement. Kure business ma kure government. Wai kunwa tengan do ngat pere. Ari dur miri 16 years manjeu. Babu ari dol ngat nan. Mak ari bol nak nan kat pere. Iman bari nak nan manur. Baik kuno wale kayo. Min manur kan nak nan. Waro na yung gi kuna gayimeng.
And so, when First Nations people were dispossessed of their land and were unable to practice their caring for country land management practices, the bush changed. It became denser, woodier, fuel loads increased, and intense wildfires also increased. Which brings me back to what I'm doing here at the Mount Buffalo National Park. This area, which so clearly shows the impacts of those increasingly intense wildfires, is also part of the solution. You see, the Mount Buffalo National Park is about to be handed back to its traditional owners. And moves like this around the nation of handing country back to First Nations people, almost always after huge battles by traditional owners, including litigation that spans decades, means that those traditional owners can again manage their country according to age-old land management practices. And this is proving to be a key way to fight climate change, as well as reduce the fuel loads feeding vast bushfires like we saw in the Black Summer fires. These ways of burning country create carbon credits, and these carbon credits are made from knowledge tested and refined over 65,000 years.
We're developing a cultural fire credit being developed between the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation and the Fire Sticks Alliance Corporation. The aim of the fire credit is to allow for people to be able to get out on country and practice cultural burning on country.
People can invest in cultural burning to save the country and ensure that traditional owners continue to practice looking after country.
We're aiming to raise the first $10 million for an exciting community-led program, the Cultural Fire Credit. This is a call for action for you to invest in a community grassroots level organisation that will make change throughout Australia. And I wanted to remind you of the importance that women play in caring for country.
It's so exciting that we have an Indigenous owned and developed credit for the communities to look after country. And a credit that goes through all boundaries of the carbon, of all the animals, the vegetation come back, and also the social benefits within our communities with employment and the transfer of knowledge. This is the credit to invest in, a credit that is developed by community.
Looking after our country, yeah, yeah, with fire.
And it's not only through fire stick farming and other Indigenous land practices that First Nations people are contributing mightily to the fight against climate change. It's also through the generation of clean energy. Around the world, First Nations people's land is often the best for the generation of wind and solar energy, particularly at a large scale. In Australia, for example, First Nations people hold rights and interests in land in approximately 40% of the Australian continent, and much of those areas are excellent for both wind and solar, particularly at a large and industrial scale. These large-scale wind and solar farms are essential in the energy transition to power your homes, to power factories, as well as their flow-on industries like hydrogen and ammonia. And then community and small-scale solar installations are perfect for First Nations communities who are living in places that are getting increasingly hotter.
Our people have been caring for country and protecting sacred places for thousands of years. With the opportunities of clean energy, we can continue to. The First Nations Clean Energy Network will make sure Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are central to the clean energy boom.
With affordable, clean power to stay on country and power our homes wherever we live.
We can generate First Nations businesses and jobs and be the proud owners of community projects. We'll also form strong partnerships with industry and government, so we're at the table as medium to large-scale projects are developed. We all know we must move to clean energy to address climate change.
My islands, for example, back in the Torres Strait, being lost to rising seas. We need climate action, so this is a really smart thing to do.
We can all play a role in helping to slow climate change just by making different choices about how we produce energy.
This is how much we spend on the power cards. Money down the drain.
There's a lot of sick people too living in these houses, you know, want power and keep their medication cool, keep their place cool as well.
A lot of remote communities right now are being powered by diesel generators. They're extremely expensive to run and to maintain. So we can start to swap these out or supplement these with clean energy, things like solar and wind power.
We will assert our right to consent or not to projects on our country.
Aboriginal people need to be front and centre of these projects, and we can do that. We have the intelligence and the capacity, and we need to be part of the journey right now.
We'd like to encourage all mob to come and join the network, and anybody who'd like to offer support.
It's about building power with our networks by collectivising our voices around the need for clean energy.
I'm on board, get on board, let's invest, let's do this, let's show the nation Australia that we can lead. We need to make this transition right now.
We will make sure clean energy is done the right way, driven by our communities.
And developed so it sustains country and culture for generations to come.
From the sun, it shines on the solar light.
The clean energy. It's really good.
If I had solar power, this wouldn't be here.
Hopefully solar will be the future for our communities.
And so what can you do to help First Nations people help us out of the climate catastrophe? Well, first of all, go and have a look at the websites of excellent Indigenous organisations around the world, in Canada, in New Zealand, in South America, in Mexico, in Australia. Organisations like the inspiring First Nations Clean Energy Network and the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation and Fire Stick Farming Alliance. Have a look at their websites. They contain excellent resources for how you can help. Some of the ideas they have is that if you regularly buy carbon credits, for example, make sure you buy them from First Nations groups. Make sure they are First Nations generated. If you're an investor in any sort of resource company, chances are they're doing business on country owned by First Nations people, whether these are extractive companies or renewable companies. Companies like BHP or Fortescue are doing huge amounts of renewable energy projects in Western Australia, for example. Ask them whether they are following best practices for developing on First Nations people's land. And if you're confused about what that looks like, have a look at the website of the First Nations Clean Energy Network website. They have very detailed and specific guides for what that should look like. Many thanks for your time, and please, let's all of us put more trust in First Nations people to help save us all from the climate catastrophe.